novel we're going to spend time with today and next time is Stendhal's The Red and the Black. The reason I chose The Red and the Black is fairly interesting. I was teaching a course in Nobel Prize winners in literature, which I try to do every fall, and noticed that at least three of the older Nobel Prize winners, Mahfouz from Egypt and Cella from Spain, and Canetti from Bulgaria, when they were asked who influenced your writing the most, or who influenced your ideas the most, all mentioned Stendhal. And so when I began to shape this course, I figured if the Nobel Prize winners in literature feel that Henri-Marie Beyle influenced their writing, then we ought to put him in the class. And those of you who in the next 25 years will publish your 8 novels and place yourself in a position to be named Nobel Prize winner in literature, will also be able to say that you had an opportunity to study the works of Stendhal. The novel, The Red and the Black, is really a rather interesting novel. I'm going to just outline it briefly and then give some background and go into some of the major points of this novel. I'm not this week going to deal with the Greases, with the various categories in which I've divided the novel. I'm going to take a different tack at this point. And then next week, in the first half of the class, we'll be dealing with the Greases, and in the second half, you'll have the opportunity to examine yourself on these points. And there will be an objective quiz at the beginning of about 65 to 80 questions, and then several essay questions. You may choose to discuss all 5 novels if you wish and to answer questions on all 5, or you may opt out of one. You may choose only to present yourself on 4 novels, in which case you'll be evaluated on the basis of your understanding of the 4. I'm always interested to see which novel people choose not to study, not because it tests your judgment or allows me to appraise your judgment, but only helps me understand at which period of the semester you were busiest. The Red and the Black deals with a major character by the name of Julian Sorel, who is an exceptionally brilliant son of a carpenter. And we're going to talk about the meaning of these differences and the importance of these differences in a few moments. He finds himself, because of his intellect, adversarial to his brothers, and while he wants to learn, they're helping their father make a living as carpenters. Because he can commit to memory the whole Bible, and because he has special intellectual capabilities, Julian Sorel, however, is headed to a different type of life. He's headed to a life in the church or a life as an assistant to others in the community. In fact, we discover that he is secretly an admirer of Napoleon, which indicates that his leanings are liberal, provincial, unaristocratic. And the meaning of this in terms of the politics of the time is something we'll discuss shortly when we discuss the career of Napoleon and the career of Stendhal himself. However, in the times in which he is living and amongst the people with whom he is working, it is better for him to hide his liberal tendencies because enough reactions have occurred, enough new republics have been established, enough new governments have been altered, that the people are in a conservative mood and unwilling to accept liberal thought or Napoleonic thought. We'll be more particular about that in a few moments. One of the people in the area, the mayor of Verrières, Monsieur de Renal, is impressed with Julian and needs an individual who will tutor his children. And so he brings Julian Sorel into his household, where he has two children, Stanislas, the most important one, and he not only brings him into his household, but he has to buy him clothes, he has to make him presentable, because Renal, who is a nail maker and an industrialist, has moved from his bourgeois society, from his middle-class society, from his mercantilistic society, into a higher society where he's been chosen as mayor of the town. And the difference in class status is relatively important to him and his wife, suggesting some of the changes in the cultural attitudes of people living in that area. And, of course, as we'll understand in a few moments, the various class differences that are recognizable and quite noticeable in France in the Republic. Julian is a good tutor. At first he meets the madam of the house, Madame de Renal, who he finds is beautiful, whom he feels is a good mate for her husband, until he discovers that she is bored with her husband. And at that point, Julian sets out on a campaign to win Madame de Renal, and he does. Stendhal says that at the moment in which he loses his virginity, he feels like a 16-year-old girl. However, he seems much more concerned about his feelings than hers, his triumph. And we recognize that Julian Sorel is probably one of the most selfish, self-centered, innerly directed, self-motivated person you'll ever find in literature. And some of you, most of you, when you finish the story of The Red and the Black, will realize that these Nobel Prize winners who were influenced by Stendhal were particularly entranced not by a hero, but by an anti-hero. Not by someone who triumphs, but by someone who fails. Not by someone who is likable, but by someone whom you yourself would not care to have either as a friend or as a political ally. In other words, we're dealing here with the character of the anti-hero in literature and the way in which figures who are not attractive, in the sense that their personalities disaffect us. We're dealing with a person whom we would not characterize as a hero in earlier literature. We would characterize him as a villain. And yet, of course, he is the central character, the major protagonist of The Red and the Black. The love affair that Julian has with Madame Renal ends when her youngest child falls ill, and she feels guilty about it and feels that she is being punished for her adultery. Now, rumors of this affair have been rampant in Verrières, and Madame de Renal has attempted and does attempt to ward off the suspicions of her husband. At that point, Julian feels it is better, or they all feel it is better for him to leave. He has an offer from his friend, Fouquet, to join his lumbering business. But Julian Sorel has greater ambitions. And what are these ambitions? The first new move for him is entrance into the seminary, where he's going to study for the priesthood. And at this point, he discovers that he himself is far brighter than most of the people who go into the priesthood. He realizes that most of the priests are ignorant country people who will do exactly what the church requires them to do and no more, who will supervise the activities of the church, and as Stendhal was to have said, or says in this novel, 5,000 priests can keep an entire nation under control for the elite, for the rich, for the monarchists, and for those who would know how to exploit the French. At the seminary, Julian Sorel meets the director, the Abbé Pirard, Pirard, who is a Jansenist, that is, he's somewhat of an evangelical in the 19th century. He's very much different from the politically minded Jesuits who, though banned in England to this time, are nevertheless very much influential in public affairs. At this point, Julian is advanced along with the Abbé Pirard to another home, the home of the Marquis de la Mole, who is a very rich man, a man of stature, a man who is not among the nouveau riche, but who admire the Abbé Pirard and will accept his advice. And so, the Marquis de la Mole, at the urging of the Abbé Pirard, gives Julian the post as secretary to the Marquis. Julian then quits the seminary, goes to Paris. But before he goes to Paris, he goes back to see Madame de Renal in a madcap scene that was somewhat reminiscent of Don Juan's escape in that famous poem by Byron. And Julian has to jump out a window as members of the household shoot after him during his escape. Julian then moves on to a more aristocratic setting, and that's in Paris, the Hôtel de la Mole, a very fancy home, where he insinuates himself more and more into the affairs of the Marquis de la Mole, because he is politically minded. He's able to maintain a certain decorum and a certain secrecy. And because Monsieur de la Mole, who is an aristocrat, who is a monarchist, who believes in the royalty, has no idea what Julian Sorel's political sentiments are. Julian, in this situation, meets Monsieur de la Mole's daughter, Mathilde. And at first, they're very cold to each other, but very soon, Julian falls in love with her. They have an affair, and it becomes apparent that Mathilde de la Mole must marry Julian. Her father is upset, enraged, angry that a man of Julian's stature, a carpenter's son, is going to be the one who must marry his daughter. But he submits and gives Julian a commission in the 15th Regiment of the Hussars and gives him an aristocratic title, Lavernaye, Vernaye. Now, that's an interesting situation, because to be titled is something that Julian never expected. But one of the characteristics of Napoleon was that a great many people were given titles who came from low background. And Napoleon's titles and the people whom he rewarded established a new type of aristocracy in France after his reign. Had they married yet? No. Monsieur de la Mole hoped to make marriage arrangements. He had to make marriage arrangements. And for some reason, Julian made a fatal error. Well, he's been making errors throughout this novel. There's no question about that. We'll be discussing more of his fatal errors. But he made a fatal error. He gave Monsieur de la Mole a list of people who could serve as references for himself. And he gave Monsieur de la Mole the name of Madame de Renal. The letter from Madame de Renal would probably have been answered favorably, except it was intercepted by her confessor priest, who then made her write a letter denouncing Julian Sorel, pointing him out as a profligate, pointing him out as a person who insinuated himself into women's homes, seduced them, hoped to gain their fortune, and then would leave them, which is not what happened with Madame de Renal at all. But in any case, Monsieur de la Mole decided then that he would not allow this marriage, even though Matilda was pregnant. Julian then became totally irate. He goes to church where he sees Madame de Renal, where he expects to find her, and shoots her. Fortunately, she doesn't die, but that doesn't matter, because his decision to try to murder her is tantamount to murder in the French courts, and Julian then is taken to prison and sentenced to be guillotined. He is guillotined, and his head becomes a trophy for one of his lovers. One, his wife, he says, the other, his mistress. He considers Matilda de la Mole his wife. He was going to marry her, but he considers Madame de Renal his mistress. And the gory business, or the trophy of his head, at the end of the novel, becomes a rather striking and almost shocking conclusion to a novel which throughout has many shocking points. Now, the key to the novel, of course, is contrast. And this is one of the points we're going to talk about as we move into our discussion. And so if you'd look at this chart, please, on the board, I've drawn a few contrasts here. And my impression is that the words, the red and the black, mean contrast. The red represents hope, aristocracy, ambition, success, determination, potential. The black represents common life, mundane existence, alternative categories, failure, disappointment, loss. Let's look for a moment and see what these differences might be. And we're going to talk about them in much greater detail as the evening progresses. First of all, Paris represents the red. That's the city of museums, that's the city of art pieces, that's the city of the seat of the crown, that's the city that has the fine houses and the fine life, as opposed to Verrières, and to all extent and purposes, Verrières reminds us of Grenoble, where Stendhal was born. Another contrast would be Julian Sorel, in this case, is the red. He represents ambition, pride, brilliance, and intelligence, and his brothers represent entirely the opposite. They torture him, they chide him, they attack him, they make his life miserable because he's the bright one. The next category, you have Monsieur Valenod, who is in charge of the poorhouse and the prison, and who would prefer and could pay a great deal more money to have Julian manage his children than Monsieur de Renal. Monsieur de Renal represents the nouveau rich. And fortunately, in this case, he does have Julian Sorel, but he represents the black as opposed to Valenod, who represents the red, who represents the greater power and the aristocracy. You may disagree with some of these categories, and you may come up with some of your own. But the next one would be Madame de la Mole, who represents the richest woman in the story, fabulously rich, and her father, who is among the old rich, as opposed to Madame de Renal, who has just come into her fortune through her husband, who has the nail factory, the metal nail factory, and who has just been elected mayor of Verrières. The red here represents Julian Sorel, in contrast with the seminarians. And we'll get to the passage where we see the difference between Sorel and the seminarians. He's brilliant and can memorize text. The seminarians are dull-witted and will do the job of normal parish priest. Another category, the soldier, the hero, the man in uniform. And we'll see Sorel in uniform in parts of this novel, as opposed to Sorel as a priest, or in which case we see that the priests are serving the men of wealth, serving the men of the community, and in most cases of the novel, with the exception of in most cases in this novel, the priests serve their community, they serve their political leaders, much more than they serve their God. In the workhouse and the poorhouse, Valenod is the supervisor, and he eats fine food off fine plates, whereas the prisoners are silenced, not allowed to sing, barely have enough to eat, are probably starving in the same residence. The Pope, of course, would represent grandeur, power. The priest, no. There is a difference in this novel between Roman Catholicism and French Roman Catholicism. Traditionally, the French Roman Catholics are the liberal members of the party. the French Roman Catholics are more inclined to subject their thoughts, their theology, to the will of the nation and to the will of their political leaders sooner than they would to the will of the Pope. And even today, the French Roman Catholics are considered amongst the liberals of the Church. And to the same extent, ultramontism, which is the papal word from the throne of the Pope. You speak from the mountain, and you speak with a divine presence. The ultramontism of the Roman Catholic Church is contrasted with the sense of personal liberty that Napoleon has brought. And the ultramontism of the Church is opposed by the desire for personal liberty of the French Church. I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church in this case. The Roman Catholics are the aristocracy as opposed to the Huguenots who are oppressed. The Jesuits are the aristocrats of the church politicians. They are the ones who engage in subterfuge. They are the ones who have the political know-how that can, in fact, frighten the papal throne itself, as opposed to the Huguenots who are oppressed in France. I've also contrasted La Vernay with Julian Sorel. La Vernay is Julian Sorel's name when he's given a title, as opposed to his family name where he comes from the home of a carpenter. Now, I can suggest others, but at this point, perhaps you or those at West Houston or those at North Houston might have some suggestions as to the various contrasts you've read in this novel and the various differences that you think you can identify. Any voices from North Houston? Any voices from West Houston? How many people are at West Houston tonight? 3. Oh, wonderful. I mailed the papers to everybody, and where I didn't have mail addresses, I used the phone book, the university phone book, and I hope the addresses were accurate. So I hope you've received your papers. If you didn't receive your paper, there'll be another contrast, those who have received their papers and those who haven't. Further contrasts that anyone would like to recommend from the novel. Well, as we proceed, the opportunity will avail itself for you to refreshen yourself on certain points, and we'll move on from there. But the red and the black is symbolic of difference, contrast. And I'm going to show you in just a few moments what one of the major contrasts was in France when the novel was being written, because I'd like to spend a few moments reviewing the historical facts that help you understand why the aristocrats are suffering either despair or why they are pleased with the change in political events. At some point you'll discover that the monarchists are pleased with the government. In other cases you'll discover that the liberals are pleased with the government. And that's because during Stendhal's lifetime, the French government changed about 10 different times. And each time it was reaction against reaction. Now, of course, the major figure in the whole business was Napoleon Bonaparte, who was born in 1769 and died in 1821. Napoleon was 7 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed. He was 20 years old when the French Revolution began. He was born of Corsican nobility, and one of the leaders of the Corsican rebellion against Genoa for many years was a man by the name of Paoli, P-A-O-L-I. James Boswell visited Paoli in Corsica and brought Paoli to England, where Boswell's book on Corsica was a bestseller. Meeting a guerrilla leader and writing about him was instantly newsworthy and of interest to the reading public in England. Napoleon, in 1784, went to an artillery school, the École Militaire, where for a year he studied the latest techniques in artillery and artillery gunnery. That's the only thing that Napoleon and I probably have in common. We both were in the artillery in the military, and he was an officer, though I was not. The French Revolution in 1789 had this young military officer in some ways proving himself very, very skillful and gaining rank very fast. April 20th, 1792, France declared war on Austria. And with a set of complicated developments, Paoli sided with the English against the French. And Napoleon's family was forced to flee Corsica and lost everything they had, so that Napoleon was penniless. But in the meantime, he had written some documents describing military strategy, and he had been appointed in February 1794 general in command of the artillery in Italy. Now, that wasn't as big a position as it sounds, but it was very, very impressive for a general that young. How old was he? 25 years old. And he was already named to the rank of general. October 14, 1795, the Republic was in trouble, and Napoleon moved the guns into the square and shot down the opponents on the steps of the church of Saint Roch, at which point the rulers of France were immeasurably grateful to him for his support. In March 1796, among his prizes was a Creole by the name of Josephine, whom he... Oh, I'm sorry. All right. In March 1796, he married Josephine. And then he led, gaining power, and I'm not going to go into all the issues. We still need the pad, thank you. You see, I have more authority now, I can assure you, than when I was in the artillery. Give you a few moments to write this down. But April 10th, 1796, Napoleon entered Italy, and then he moved an Egyptian campaign in 1798 where he conquered Cairo, but he lost his first major battle in Acre in in Palestine, and he lost to Admiral Sidney Smith. Finally, November 9th, 1799, Napoleon, who had proven himself not only to be a brilliant military general, but a brilliant politician, a man capable of energizing the people, stored a coup d'etat on the French government and established his own government. Who was there on June 4, 1800, at the victory of Marengo in Italy when Napoleon then conquered Italy. Stendhal, a soldier at the age of 17, fighting for Napoleon. And this is the point I'm trying to make. Stendhal, when he entered I'm trying to think which. Stendhal, when he moved into Italy with Napoleon's troops at the age of 17, saw paved streets, spacious residences and palaces, mostly in the classical style of the 17th and early 18th centuries. They seemed more imposing than in any other city. Stendhal worked and lived in the Ada Palace, and Stendhal worked and lived in the Ada Palace in the service of General Petiet, who is the paymaster of the army of Italy. And at that time, Stendhal was a subaltern in the 6th Dragoons. Let's put the pad on again, thank you. From Italy, September 28, 1800, Stendhal writes to his sister, describes what kind of work he's doing, celebrates the heroism of Napoleon, and at that point, France reclaimed land on the left bank of the Rhine. Napoleon then gave France back lands that had been won in wars to Austria, to the extent that France was as big as the Gaul of Caesar's day. And Stendhal was part of it. Stendhal was in Italy. Stendhal was celebrating Napoleon's victories, and he was as much a soldier as anyone else. In April 1802, Stendhal was back in France, and in December 2nd, 1804, Napoleon was crowned emperor. And if you remember the story, Napoleon felt that he wanted to restore the grandeur of the ancient empires, give France back its empire, but he wanted to gain the support of the Roman Catholic Church. He wanted to restore the clergy and give them a sense of power because of the power it would give him. And so he insisted that the Pope come to crown him. The Pope was reluctant, but finally decided to do it. And if you remember, as the Pope was giving him the crown, Napoleon took it from him and put it on his own head. So he, in effect, crowned himself. Among the things that Napoleon did was to give citizenship to the entire country. He gave citizenship to religions and to people who had not had it before, because he needed vast amounts of manpower in his army, and he needed support. He named a great many people to the nobility to gain support of the public, and one of the people whom he named was Madame Saint-Jean, who was a washerwoman, who became the Duchess of Danzig. At that point, now remember, throughout all these occurrences, Stendhal is with Napoleon. So, when you see the differences between the monarchists whom Napoleon opposed and the liberals whom he constituted, when you see the difference between the old rich and the nouveau riche, when you see the difference between prefects who have gained power as opposed to people who had no power before, you see that Napoleon, in fact, altered the French psychology, the French government, and gave hope to large numbers of people from families like Sorel's, who discovered that they could gain the riches and the fruits of power that only the aristocrats before them had. This didn't last as long as we thought it would last. One of Napoleon's problems was that he could never conquer the British Navy. And he could only move into Belgium, he could only move easily through the Mediterranean if he was able to assert himself. The British Navy proved victorious against the French in the Mediterranean. December 2nd, 1805, Napoleon, however, achieved victory at Austerlitz. There were various conflicts between France and Spain, and Napoleon began losing some of the strength he had in Spain and some of the strength he had elsewhere. August 1, 1810, we get back to Stendhal to see where Stendhal was in all this. Let's go back to the pad, thank you. August 1, 1810. Stendhal was one of 300 auditors to serve in the Council of State. Now that was a rather important position because Napoleon named about 600 new officials, and the 300 auditors comprised a very important set of figures, and Stendhal was one of them. Stendhal was with the French when they entered the ruins of Moscow. Something happened to my spell check here. I see all kinds of errors coming up here that shouldn't be here. Pardon me? Oh, you're right. September 20th, the French entered the ruins of Moscow. And if you remember, the scorched earth policy of the Russians was used for the second time. It had been used with Charles XII of Sweden in the 18th century. It was used again here, and it would be used again with Adolf Hitler's invasion of Moscow. But when Napoleon thought he would gain strength entering Russia, he actually led himself into full disaster. Stendhal writes about entering Moscow and expecting to see the riches of the city, only to discover that 4/5 of the dwellings were razed, churches were the only thing remaining, and the walled elements of the Kremlin. September 21st, 1811, Stendhal was involved in his own love affair with Angela Gina Baroni Petagrua, whom he thought he would marry, but whose father finally decided he was too dissolute, too much of a reprobate for his 19-year-old daughter. July 27th, 1812, Stendhal was serving on the commissary staff of the Grand Army at the Russian front. The French had 640,000 men, and Stendhal's job was to make sure that everyone had food to eat, which became more and more difficult as the Russians burned everything in the retreat and made the accessibility to food very, very difficult. Stendhal was also involved in the retreat from Russia. He had some real problems. But one of the problems was the way the French troops were acting. When they discovered that they had to flee, he wanted them to load flour, he wanted them to load food, he wanted them to load wheat from the storehouses on their horses, and instead they were loading their saddlebags with gold and silver, candelabras, and Stendhal reported himself that there were soldiers dying for want of food who, when their bodies were turned over, had pockets full of gold coins and pockets full of money. So Stendhal was the supply officer, the Vettler, the commissary officer, and found himself having a great deal of difficulty supplying the army. August 14, 1812, in retreat, he was in a carriage, and not enough people could get on the bridge. he decided to go downstream and see if he could cross at a shallower point, and in fact saved at least one life of a friend by carrying him in the carriage across a shallow ford and getting away. So that Stendhal, when you realize Julian Sorel's desire and love for Napoleon, it's mirroring. He is mirroring Stendhal's own experience and Stendhal's own fidelity. On December 4th, 1812, Stendhal, with a French army in tatters, arrived in Vilna. Now, when Stendhal returned back to Paris, he discovered a very bitter disappointment. He expected to be appointed a prefect, one of 13 new prefects, and instead he found two people who were lower in rank than he, who were promoted above him instead of himself, who had worked for him. He was really quite disillusioned, but they had the advantage of staying at home and maintaining their political ties. And I guess people forgot who he was at some point. However, by June 1813, Stendhal was appointed by Napoleon intendant in charge of the fortified city of Sagan in Silesia. I'm not going to go into all the details here. The reports are that he ruled like a king over the city of Sagan, but he became weakened with typhoid and had to abandon that position. April 11th, 1814, Napoleon abdicated at Fontainebleau. And May 5th, 1814, in his place, a monarchist appeared in Paris, Louis XVIII, to restore the monarchy. Napoleon was consigned to Elba at the age of 45, and Stendhal, on July 20th, 1814, had to flee to Milan, where he lived until 1821 because he was no longer among the political favorites. In fact, he was forced to leave Milan under the suspicion of espionage. The tempestuous times continued. There was representative government established in Paris. The prefects were retained under the new emperor. But on March 1st, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba, returned to France, marshaled a very strong popular movement, even though people had been disillusioned by him, but he had this magnetic capability, and Louis fled Paris. But the English and the Allies finally decided and declared Napoleon an outlaw. They raised an army, and at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon lost his last battle. Stendhal wrote, "Now at last, young artists would no longer need to die for their country unheard." October 15th, 1815, Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena by the British. He had a little cottage. They treated him like a criminal. They worried that he would try to escape again. Even though his own doctor had come with him to the island, he was shortly thereafter displaced by a doctor of the Englishes, choosing by the Englishmen, and Napoleon died in May 21st, 1821. At which point, Stendhal had not yet reached his fame as an author, but he was on his way. In 1822, he wrote a novel called De l'Amour. And in 1830, the new revolution collapsed, Charles X sought refuge in Italy, and the National Guard came to power, at which point in 1830, the year of the famous revolution, Stendhal wrote The Red and the Black, Le Rouge et le Noir. November 25th, 1830, Stendhal was appointed Consul of Trieste, and they say he looked imposing in his blue uniform, his high embroidered collar, gold buttons. He was in charge of 6 clerks and various consular agents. So under the new government, he had power and he had prestige. At which point he thought he would win this 19-year-old girl who had fallen in love with him, who had given herself to him, much to his surprise. He was always trying to seduce women and always finding himself having difficulty doing so. But he had enough mistresses, as a soldier might normally suppose himself capable of having. But in this case, he found a woman, a young woman, 19 years old, whom he really was in love with, but her father rejected him. And 2 years later, when she married, he was gravely disappointed. 1838, the Charter. 1840, he wrote the Charter House of Parma, and it's at that point that Balzac wrote a famous review claiming that Stendhal was a major writer in the French language and gave him instant fame. Well, that is the background of Stendhal, and I'm sorry if the review of the history has been sketchy. There are a great many details there that one should build upon. There are details that ought not have been sloughed over so quickly. There are explanations that ought to be given to clarify these issues. But biographies on Stendhal mentioned in your bibliography present these details to you, and you shouldn't have any trouble handling them. When I mentioned before his amazement at the fine buildings in Italy, I was referring at that point to the city of Milan. Now, what I'd like to do is spend some time before the break talking about a few episodes in The Red and the Black that give you some idea of the contrast that was shown. But before that, I just want to remind you of the political situation in France again. Remember 1792, you can mark these dates down. I don't have them printed. 1792 to 1804 was the first Republic of France. The first empire, Napoleon's empire, ran from 1804 to 1815. Napoleon really ruled 11 years, 1804 to 1815, during which time Stendhal was a military officer. From 1815 to 1848, you had the restoration of the monarchy. 1815 to 1848. But you had that revolution of 1830, which momentarily reasserted the popular government that Stendhal himself represented. And at that time, the revolution of 1830 occurred, and about a few months after that, Charles X is overthrown and a provisional government established with Louis Philippe, Philippe, the bourgeois monarch. we won't go past the Second Republic, the Second French Republic. Bears these dates. 1848 to 1852 marked the Second Republic. And then the Second Empire, under Napoleon III, endured from 1852 to 1871. Now those are the only dates I want to give you because the historical perspective is only important in recognizing why Julian had to keep his silence. Why he no longer, in 1830, could support Napoleon or speak his love or his desire for Napoleon. And remember the episode where it is thought that he is hiding secrets in his mattress and he doesn't want anyone to know what's in his mattress because he claims they're love letters, but really they're it's a picture of Napoleon. It's more disgraceful to have a picture of Napoleon in your mattress than to have the letters of your mistress. Now let's take a few moments to review some of the events that occur in this book. If you remember, chapter 1 opens up and gives us a sense of the village of Verrières, which doesn't really exist, but it is Grenoble. And let me get my book here so I can read a few passages and we'll see how these contrasts work themselves out. I mentioned contrasts, that the red and the black is replete with contrasts. If you look on page 2, you get some idea of what the contrasts are in this novel. We have a description of the city first, the country. Verrières is flanked on the north by a lofty mountain, one of the spurs of the Jura. As soon as it grows cold in October, the ragged peaks of Verrières are covered with snow. A brook which drops from the mountain passes through Verrières before falling into the Doubs provides power for a number of sawmills. It is a simple industry and yields a certain prosperity for a fair number of the inhabitants who are peasants rather than bourgeois. Still, the sawmills are not what has made this little town rich. The manufacture of so-called Mulhouse cotton prints is responsible for the general affluence that, since the fall of Napoleon, has resulted in new facades for almost all the houses of Verrières. So you get a pastoral scene, you get some idea of the mercantilism, but then we move into industrialization. Remember that the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century is moving into the large factories and the industrial towns of England and France in the 19th century. Remember, 1830 is the Revolution. 1820, the first steamboat on the Mississippi River. So we're beginning to move into industrialization, and it won't be but 100 years after this or 90 years after this that we have the assembly line in America. Listen to how he describes the factories. Stendhal writes on page 2, "Scarcely inside the town, one is stunned by the racket of a roaring machine, frightful in its appearance. 20 ponderous hammers, falling with a crash which makes the street shudder, are lifted for each new stroke by the power of a water wheel. Every one of these hammers makes every day, I don't know how many thousand nails. The workmen are pretty, fresh-faced girls, They slip little slivers of iron into place beneath the sledgehammers, which promptly transform them into nails. A primitive factory like this provides one of those sights that most surprise the traveler as he enters for the first time the mountains separating France from Switzerland. If, when he gets into Verrières, the traveler asks who owns that handsome nail factory which deafens everyone on the main street, he will be told in drawling tones, "Oh, it's the mayor's." Now, you've caught the shift in scenery. You've caught the shift in differences between the natural outdoors and the factory. You've caught the difference between people living outdoors and people living indoors. But did you catch that one very subtle difference that suggests the cynicism of a description of the country and the city? He said, the people reply in drawling tones, "Oh, it's the mayor's." So in the country, you have people drawling. In the city, you've got specific, precise language. And that in itself suggests all the differences that Stendhal is drawing in this novel between the rich and the poor, between the intelligent and those who work stupidly and indifferently, between those who are the new rich and those who are the old rich, between those who can achieve political success and those who will forever be mired as subalterns. Just that one phrase, drawled, makes a difference. And you have to become very, very familiar with the language and the problems that Stendhal is giving us here. Incidentally, the whole world of industrialization is made clear for us in The Wealth of Nations, and the English book written by Adam Smith in 1776, where he uses pins. He just takes the metaphor of pins, or the production of pins, to show how mass production is changing the face of the workforce. What does he say about the mayor of Verrières on page 3? Such is the mayor of Verrières, Monsieur de Rênal. Having walked solemnly down the street, he enters the town hall and disappears from the view of the traveler. But if the traveler, but 100 feet further on, if our traveler continues to stroll, he will see a fine house, and through an iron grating next to the house, magnificent gardens. He learns the house belongs to Monsieur de Rênal. Thanks to the profits from his great nail factory, the mayor of Verrières now owns this fine mansion of cut stone, which has just been completed. Next paragraph. Since 1815, he has been ashamed of being in trade. What happened in 1815? Right, the Restoration. Napoleon's gone. These dates are really important. Since 1815, he has been ashamed of being in trade. 1815 made him mayor of Verrières. The terrace walls holding up various parts of that magnificent garden which descends in stages to the Doubs are also the reward of Monsieur de Rênal's dexterity in the iron trade. The next contrast is the contrast of fathers and sons, and we're going to spend more time with that sometime later today or early next week. If you turn to page 13, when Monsieur de Rênal is apprised of Julian's brilliance and wants him to handle his children, the father realizes that he can make a profit out of this. And so he dickers with Monsieur de Rênal and turns out to be a fairly clever businessman in exploiting the son he really doesn't care to have around. Look at this scene. where the father is looking for his son. Bottom of page 12. Approaching his mill, old Sorel bellowed for Julian. Nobody answered. He saw only his elder sons, a couple of giants who were working with heavy axes, squaring off some pine trunks they were preparing for the saw. They were intent on following exactly the black lines drawn on the wood. At every blow of their axes, huge chips flew through the air. They did not hear their father's voice. He turned toward the shed, entered, and looked vainly for Julian at the station where he should have been, beside the saw. At last he saw him, 5 or 6 feet higher, astraddle one of the roof beams. Instead of keeping close watch on the working of the machine, Julian was reading a book. Nothing could have been more disagreeable to old Sorel. He might perhaps have pardoned Julian his slender figure, unsuited to hard labor and unlike his elder brothers. But this passion for reading was hateful to him, as he didn't know how to read himself. He called Julian vainly 2 or 3 times. The young man's absorption in his book, much more than the roar of the saw, prevented him from hearing his father's terrible voice. Finally, despite his age, the old man jumped lightly onto the tree trunk which was being sawed, and from there to the crossbeam which helped support the roof. A violent blow sent Julian's book flying into the stream. A second cuff, just as heavy, fell on his head and caused him to lose his balance. He was about to fall a distance of 10 or 15 feet into the middle of machinery which would have ground him up, but his father caught him with the left hand just as he was falling. "All right, loafer! Still reading your damn books while you're supposed to be watching the saw? Read them after work when you're wasting your time with a priest, why don't you?" Contrast, father and son. It's not entirely new, however. I know of many years ago, I knew of a young lady who took a job at a switchboard while she was in high school, because she wanted to read, and that was a good opportunity to read, and when she was home, her parents felt she was wasting her time if she was reading. Well, hopefully that's not all part of the experience today. But again, when you're talking about the red and the black, in this case, Julian would be the red, the father would be the black, and you would see this contrast between what would be commendable activity and what is considered unnecessary and wasteful activity. On page 58, you come into this episode where Julian has left the home of Madame de Renal, and he discovers that he has a job offer. His friend Fouquet wants him to go into the lumber business with him. Again, contrasts. If you go into business, you're going to be tied down. Your activity will be circumscribed. Your goals will be limited. You'll make a lot of money. But for Julian Sorel, it wouldn't give him the position he wanted, the post he desired, the fame he needed, and the experiences he had not yet enjoyed. We see him talking to his friend. First of all, we see him leaving Madame Renal. Bottom of page 56. Stendhal writes, "While Madame de Renal was suffering the cruelest pangs of the terrible passion in which misfortune had entrapped her, Julian followed cheerfully along his path amid the most beautiful scenery our mountains can afford." How do you like that statement? Amid the most beautiful scenery our mountains can afford. Page 58, we see the contrast. Fouquet says, stay with me. Your mathematics is better than mine. You can keep my accounts. He's made him an offer. You go into partnership with me. Let's run a lumber business. Your mathematics is better than mine. You can keep my accounts. I make good money at this trade, but I can't do everything myself. And if I take in a partner, I'm afraid of getting a rascal. So every day I'm forced to pass up some excellent deal. Not a month ago I put Michaud de Saint-Ramond in the way of making 6,000 francs. I hadn't seen him for 6 years, and I met him only by accident at the auction in Pontarlier. Why shouldn't you have made those 6,000 francs? Or at least 3,000 of them, we would share them. For I'd had you with me that day, and I'd put my own bid for that stand of wood. And I'd have got it to. So be my partner. What does Stendhal tell us? This offer disturbed Julian. It interfered with his crazy dreams. Throughout the supper, which the two friends prepared for themselves like Homeric heroes, for Fouquet lived all alone, he went over his books with Julian and showed him the advantage of his trade in wood. Fouquet had the loftiest notion of Julian's character and intelligence. But Julian doesn't want to do it. He says he has to leave. Next morning, suddenly Julian was happy at his decision not to join Fouquet. He had a reason for his refusal. What? To squander in base pursuits 7 or 8 years? In that way I should reach the age of 28. And by that age, Bonaparte had already performed his finest actions. Bonaparte, by the time he was 21, was a general. By the time Julian Sorel is 23, he'll be dead. And that's part of the irony of the novel. And the novel is replete with these ironies. One of the ironies, and we'll read about it in the novel, is that Julian Sorel is up for one of the top positions in the seminary. And the priest, who doesn't want him to have the position, entices him into speaking about his Latin scholarship, his interest in Horace and Homer. And when Julian Sorel waxes eloquently about these classical writers, the priest puts him down and says, you shouldn't be wasting your time with this. And Julian finds himself at the bottom of the list of the class rather than at the top. And he learns a very important political lesson. Don't tell everyone everything you know if you want to move ahead in politics. Tell them what you think they want to know. And with that bit of information and that bit of advice, we recognize that Julian Sorel is on his way to major successes and ultimately his most disastrous failures. But we'll pick this up in 10 minutes and talk about the red and the black. Thank you.